He was called a coward, humiliated by his own comrades, and forced to abandon the war at one of the most crucial moments of his life. But what no one knew was that behind this decision was a man determined to prove his worth, not to others, but to himself. On a journey of pain, overcoming adversity and sacrifice, he would face his greatest fears, challenge his destiny, and ultimately become the hero no one imagined. Get ready to learn the story of Elias, a soldier who proved that true courage is born not from easy victory, but from the ability to get back up after falling. Elias never imagined that a simple mistake, a single moment of doubt, could change his life forever. A dedicated soldier with the courage of a lion, he always believed that his mission was to serve, protect, and fight to the end. But on that day, something unexpected happened. In the midst of a fierce battle, where lives were at stake, a wrong decision put him at the center of a whirlwind of criticism. It was not a lack of courage, but a difficult choice, a decision made under pressure which could not be understood by others. War is a field of uncertainty. Every second can be the difference between life and death, and the pressure to act correctly is immense. At that specific moment, Elias was forced to make a decision that, in some way, seemed the most sensible to him. He knew he couldn't risk losing more lives unnecessarily, but his comrades in battle didn't understand. They saw his choice as betrayal, a cowardly escape. "Coward!" some shouted, while others simply looked at him with contempt. He, who had always been a symbol of strength, was now seen as a weak man, incapable of leading or facing battle. The impact of this rejection was devastating. It wasn't just words spoken by fellow soldiers. Each word carried the weight of a merciless judgment, and Elias felt that, at that moment, what he feared most was coming true. He had failed, not only with the mission, but with those who trusted him. How could he now look into the eyes of the same men who had fought alongside him, knowing that their respect for him had disappeared? The rejection was cruel. Instead of leaning on his superiors or comrades, Elias was left to deal with the shame of his choice alone. The nights began to grow longer. The feeling of failure was almost unbearable. Where once there had been camaraderie, now there was emptiness. Where once there had been the confidence of a strong man, now there was only a soldier who felt helpless and marked by a mistake he could not erase. That was how Elias found himself on the brink of the abyss. The man who had been praised for his bravery, the soldier who had always believed in his mission, now found himself treated like an outcast, someone without value. He believed in what he had done. He knew that in his mind his decision had been the only one possible. But in that moment of deep despair, it seemed irrelevant. The words of others echoed in his mind like a distant cry, an incessant accusation, "Coward!" This rejection did not come only from others. The cruelest thing was his own judgment of himself. Elias found himself in a spiral of doubt and self-questioning. He looked at the battlefield, at his companions, and asked himself, "Did I do the right thing? Am I really a coward?" Doubt consumed him, and the most painful thing was that, even in his heart of hearts, he knew the answer was not so simple. He had made the decision with the greater good in mind. But in the eyes of others, he had been a weak man. How to deal with this? How to survive such a deep blow? How to move forward when everything around you seems to be falling apart? The answer was not clear, but Elijah's story was far from over. Rejection and humiliation would not define the rest of his life. That battle would not be the last of his journey, and although he did not know it at the time, the pain of rejection would prepare him for something even greater. And this is where the story really begins, for it is in the fall, when all seems lost, that we find the true strength to rise again. Humiliation and doubt would not be his end, but the starting point for a journey of overcoming, redemption, and transformation. Elias didn't know it yet, but he was about to discover that the greatest heroes are not those who never fall, but those who, even after falling, manage to get up and fight again. The doubt he carried, the pain of rejection, would be the strength he would use to prove his worth not only to others, but more importantly to himself. Now I ask you, have you also faced the feeling of being judged, of being rejected for a difficult decision? Have you ever found yourself at rock bottom, not knowing how to get back up? If so, then Elias's story will touch your heart, because we all, at some point, face our own inner monsters. And, like him, we can choose to move on. If you identify with Elias's struggle, or are curious to know how he overcomes this rejection and becomes a hero, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. Don't miss the rest of this incredible journey of redemption and overcoming adversity. Leave your like if you believe that we all have the ability to get back up and never give up, no matter the obstacles. Let's go on this journey together, because true victory begins when you refuse to be defeated. The silence of the night was deafening. The war, which had begun with the promise of a quick and glorious victory, was now dragging on, consuming lives and hopes. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixed with the sweat and blood that stained the earth. But what weighed most heavily on Elias was not the battles fought on the field, nor the deaths he had witnessed. What tore him apart more than any physical wound was the feeling of failure that now consumed him from within. There were days when he felt the pain of shame seeping into every fiber of his body, as if he were being devoured by it. He could no longer look his companions in the eye. They who had once trusted him now treated him with contempt, as if he were the least trustworthy man alive. He felt the weight of each accusing glance, as if he were being crushed by a pressure he never imagined he could bear. The war, once a mission of honor, was now a never-ending nightmare, where he found himself trapped in a cycle of humiliation and fear. Elias was at a crossroads. Every step he took seemed more difficult, as if the ground beneath his feet was crumbling. He had made a decision, and that decision, however difficult, seemed to be the only way out for a man who felt completely lost. He looked at his comrades, the men he had called brothers, and felt that somehow there was no longer a place for him there. They talked among themselves, their harsh and relentless words about his lack of courage, about the mistake he had made, were always present in his mind. He tried to convince himself that he had done the right thing, that the decision made during the battle was the most prudent one. But deep down he knew it didn't matter. What he couldn't bear was the weight of the silent but overwhelming disapproval of his companions. He no longer had the strength to fight against it. The internal war he was waging was more intense than any physical combat. His shoulders were heavy, not because of his armor, but because of the weight of guilt and shame. His eyes, once bright with the flame of determination, were now dulled by doubt and despair. Elias knew that if he stayed there, if he remained on the battlefield, it would destroy him, not just as a soldier, but as a man. The decision to abandon the war was not easy, but it seemed to be the only way to preserve what remained of his dignity. He no longer knew who he was among those men. Who he had been when he arrived there, full of hope and courage, now seemed like a distant shadow. The honor he believed to be the soul of a soldier had faded, left behind like a memory. That no longer made sense. And it was on that dark dawn that he made his decision. Alone, with no one to ask or seek support from, he did what seemed to be the only viable option. There was no more honor for him among the soldiers. There was no more trust. There was no more place for Elias in that war. He grabbed his backpack, his weapons, and with a heavy heart began to walk away from the battlefield. Each step took him further away, not only from the war, but from everything he believed to be right. He tasted the bitter taste of defeat even before he reached the end of that road, and as he walked, the voices of his companions, calling him a coward, echoed in his mind, as if he himself were shouting those words at himself. Elias knew that by taking that path, he was throwing away the last chance he might have to prove his worth. But the pain of humiliation, the pain of being a man without honor, was greater than any expectation or judgment of others. He thought of his family, of how he would have to face their gaze when he returned home, not as a hero but as someone who had failed. He saw himself devastated, defeated by his own conscience, by his own idea of who he thought he was. But in that moment of despair, the only thing he felt was a deep and painful emptiness. The war, honor, his comrades, everything seemed distant, irrelevant. He was abandoning not only the battle, but also the only identity he had known until that moment. Elias wandered aimlessly for hours, maybe even days. His feet were sore, his hands were shaking, but his heart was even heavier. He kept wondering if he had done the right thing, if by abandoning the war he had really escaped something worse, or if he was simply running away from his own responsibility. Loneliness was his only companion on his journey, and with each step, the pain of his choice seemed to grow. The world around him was dark, but what bothered him most was the darkness he felt inside himself. Elias didn't know what the future held for him, but at that moment, he knew that the only thing left was the loneliness of his choice. He would no longer be the brave soldier, the respected warrior. He would be remembered as the man who deserted, the man who ran away when they needed him most. And the weight of that, more than any battle, seemed to be the heaviest burden he would ever have to carry. But although he did not yet know it, this lonely walk, marked by shame and doubt, would be the beginning of something much greater. For when all seemed lost, Elias's true journey would begin to unfold, a journey that, painful as it was, would lead him to something he had never imagined, his own redemption. The sound of Elias's boots echoed through the narrow, dusty streets of his hometown, but no echo of greeting accompanied him. The sun was low on the horizon, casting a golden light over the familiar landscape. But to him, everything seemed different. The town that had once seemed welcoming, full of laughter and warm encounters, was now just a distant backdrop to something he no longer recognized. Elias no longer felt part of that place. The war had changed everything within him, and the weight of his choice now made him wonder if he still had a place there. He dragged himself down the main street where, months ago, the winds of a promising victory had blown with hope. Now, everything seemed dead, as if the war had infected even the soul of the city. People passed by without looking at him, but Elias felt the furtive glances, the whispers, the fingers pointing behind his back. It was impossible not to notice. It was impossible not to feel the weight of judgment. He arrived at his parents' house, a place that, in happier times, had welcomed him with love and pride. But now his mother's gaze as she opened the door was cold. The smile she always had when she saw her son returning from a long mission was no longer there. She looked at him, speechless, but the disapproval was clear in her eyes. Elias tried to smile, to seek some comfort, but there was no room for that. You're back?" she murmured, her voice laden with silent sadness. "Mom, Elias began, but the words failed him. There was no explanation for what he felt, nothing that could justify his choice to abandon his comrades in the war. He knew that to her, he was just a son who had failed, a son who didn't have the courage to fulfill what had been promised. The silence between them was suffocating. She finally took a step back and let him in. But there was no warm embrace as he had expected. There was no warmth in the words she tried to find, just a silent and distant presence, as if she were trying to understand what had happened to the son who had once been a hero in her eyes. Elias looked around the house. Everything seemed so the same and yet so different. The smell of home cooking in the air, the old photos on the wall, his father's antique clock ticking softly. Everything seemed harmless, but to him, nothing seemed more distant than that home. He no longer felt worthy of that place. He had failed everyone. That night, his father came home. The man who had once been proud to have a soldier for a son, who shared stories of honor and glory, now seemed immensely distant. When he saw him standing at the door, backpack on his back, and an empty look in his eyes, Elias could feel the weight of disappointment in his father's eyes. "You're back early, son," said his father, trying but failing to hide the tone of disappointment. There was no joy in his words, only the bitter realization of a defeat he did not know how to face. Elias didn't know how to respond. What could he say? That he was no longer the soldier his father had hoped for? That instead of being remembered with pride, he was now a man who had taken the path of escape? How could he justify his decision to his parents when, in truth, he couldn't forgive himself? I don't know what to say, Dad. I did what I thought was right, but I couldn't take it anymore." The words came out like a sigh, but he knew there was no truth in them. There was no sufficient explanation for the pain he felt and the emptiness he had left behind when he abandoned his friends and the battle. "What did you think was right, Elias?" his father replied. his voice firm but with a tone that showed frustration and confusion. "You gave up, my son. There is no excuse for that. How do you expect to be treated here after what you did? How do you expect to look into the eyes of those who lost friends, lost companions, and come back as if nothing had happened?" His father's words cut deeper than any sword could. Elias felt small, insignificant. He knew there was no way to win this battle. There was no way to regain the respect he had lost. The city he loved, the home he considered his refuge, now rejected him, not for something he had done to others, but for what he had done to himself. He had abandoned his brothers in arms. He had fled when the fight seemed most difficult. The weight of guilt began to crush him. No matter how hard he tried to explain or justify himself, there were no words that could repair the damage he had caused. He was a marked man, and there was nothing he could do to erase the shame he carried. "You have the right not to understand, Father, but I had no choice. I didn't want to die there. I didn't want to risk anyone else's life," Elias said, his voice breaking, trying to explain what he considered the reason for his decision. "The choice was to fight to the end, Elias. That was the choice of a man of honor, of a true soldier," his father finished, already turning to leave without waiting for a response. Elias stood still, feeling loneliness envelop him like a heavy cloak. He was back where he belonged, but at the same time he was further away than he had ever been. The familiar faces, the streets he knew by heart, everything now seemed so strange, as if he were a stranger in that place. The city he had defended, which he imagined would welcome him with open arms, now treated him as if he were a fugitive. The disapproving looks on the streets, the distancing of old friends, and even the hostility of some, all left him in pieces. He had been defeated in a way that even war could not have done. The war had taken away his illusions, but the city stripped him of his dignity. On every corner, he felt the stares of people, old acquaintances, old friends who couldn't understand his decision. He, the man who had once been willing to do anything for his country, was now seen as a coward. And deep down, he knew that no words could change that. The humiliation of his return to the city was more bitter than any battle he had ever faced. Elias sat alone on the edge of a deserted square. The city was quiet, but his mind was a whirlwind. Where had he gone wrong? How had he, who had always believed in the value of honor, become this broken man? He didn't. No, but one thing was clear. His journey was far from over. The city Elias knew so well, with its quiet streets and bustling squares, was suddenly overtaken by a distressing scream that cut through the air, turning peace into chaos. The tragedy did not come with the noise of a distant war, but with the deafening sound of an explosion, so strong that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The windows of the houses shattered, and a column of black smoke rose into the sky, a sign that something terrible had happened. The smell of burning spread quickly, mixed with the panic and rush of people in the streets. Elias was at home, trying to deal with the ghosts of rejection and shame. But when he heard the explosion, his body reacted instantly. He ran to the window, his chest tight, and saw what no one could have predicted. A gigantic fire was beginning to consume the city center, where provisions, precious goods, and resources vital to everyone's survival were stored. People were running in all directions, screams of pain and panic filling the air. The city he had known and loved was now being swallowed by fire and destruction. The seconds seemed to drag on, and Elias felt a sense of helplessness wash over him. He was no longer a soldier. He was no longer on a distant battlefield where the rules of war could be justified. Now, the pain and suffering were right in front of him, in his own home, in his own city. And in that moment, he realized something devastating. He, a broken man marked by shame, could now be the last line of defense between his city and complete annihilation. Without thinking, Elias put on his cape, grabbed what was left of his weapon, and ran into the streets, looking for some way to contain the chaos. The city was in despair. The firefighters couldn't handle the scale of the fire. The houses around the center began to collapse, and there were people trapped, crushed by the rubble, screaming for help. Every corner he turned was another reminder of his failure, another reminder of what he was no longer, a hero. But at that moment, he knew he had no choice. The city that had rejected him needed him more than ever. He came across a group of people trying to save a woman trapped under the rubble. She screamed and begged, but the rubble was too heavy. Elias approached without hesitation, putting aside his doubts, shame, and fear. He knelt down and, with the strength that remained in his body, began to remove the rubble. Sweat dripped from his face, but his mind was focused. Something inside him, something he did not yet fully understand, was pushing him to act. Time seemed to stretch as he helped pull the woman out, and finally, when she was rescued, her eyes met Elias's. She didn't say a word. Her gaze said it all. There was something there, something beyond gratitude. It was as if, suddenly, he had shown himself to be more than a man marked by flaws, more than a defeated soldier. He was someone who still had a chance to make a difference, but the city was far from being saved. The fire continued to devastate everything in its path, and as Elias got up, he felt the urgency increase. Amidst the chaos, he saw an old friend, Marcos, who had once been his comrade in arms. But now he stood still, not knowing what to do, his eyes filled with frustration. "Elias, you're back," Marcos said, his voice somewhat incredulous. "Are you really going to do this?" Elias looked at him, his eyes filled with determination. "Yes. The city needs help, Marcos. We need to do this together. We can't wait any longer," said Elias, feeling that, in saying those words, he was not only asking for help, but somehow regaining something of his own humanity, his dignity. Marcos hesitated, but Elias's eyes were filled with something he couldn't ignore. A sparkle, something that resembled hope. "You're right. Let's do it," Marcos replied with a sigh of relief, as if he had finally found a purpose again. They ran into the danger zone together, with more men soon joining them, fighting the flames, helping the victims, removing debris, saving what they could. Elias felt the adrenaline rush through him, but no longer for the thrill of combat or glory. It was not an external battle he was fighting now, but an internal one. He was no longer running away. He was facing his own demons, and somehow, by saving those around him, he was beginning to save himself as well. But the tragedy was far from over. The flames seemed to have a life of their own, advancing relentlessly. The city was being destroyed, and with every step Elias took, he felt the line between life and death becoming thinner. He didn't know how much longer he could hold out, but something had changed inside him. He was no longer a defeated man. He was becoming someone who, for the first time in a long time, believed he could still make a difference. Amid the chaos, a scream pierced the air. The structure of the nearby building was about to collapse. Elias looked up and on impulse ran toward the danger. He saw a child alone, trapped between the walls that were beginning to crumble. Without hesitation, he threw himself in to save her, and in that moment, as he rescued the little life, something much greater than himself happened. He had rediscovered himself. For the first time since his fall, Elias felt truly alive. He was no longer the man who ran away. He was no longer the cowardly soldier. He was a hero, and his city, his home, needed him. But fate, as always, had more trials ahead. The fire still burned in the city, but now it was an internal flame that burned within Elias. After saving the child from the rubble and helping to rescue other civilians, a strange feeling of emptiness came over him. The smell of smoke and the sound of flames continued to echo, but in his mind, the chaos was different. The images of his mistakes, the shame of having abandoned his comrades, the judgment he carried, all merged into a silent battle within his soul. Even at the height of the struggle for survival, he found himself facing a deeper, more terrifying conflict, the confrontation with himself. With every step he took, a voice inside his mind accused him. "You are not a hero. You are no longer the man who should be here." The words of his comrades in arms, the words of his father, the disappointed expression on his mother's face, all echoed like a constant, an echo that haunted him. How could he, after all he had done, believe that he had any kind of value? How could he see himself as someone capable of saving his city when he himself had fled the battlefield at the most crucial moment? As he walked through the streets, helping to organize the evacuation and guiding the survivors, Elias felt an intense struggle within himself. He was doing what he knew was necessary. He saved lives, helped control the fire, guided residents to safer places. But with every decision he made, he questioned himself. Am I really worthy of this? Is what I'm doing now enough to redeem the man I be? He couldn't help feeling that he was still paying for his escape. He knew that others saw him as someone broken, someone who hadn't been able to face battle when life challenged him, someone who didn't deserve to be called a hero. Elias stopped in the middle of the street as a flood of feelings overwhelmed him. The sound of the fire was still loud, but now what bothered him most was the sound of his own mind, hammering away at him relentlessly. What do you think you're doing? You're just trying to redeem yourself. That won't erase what you did. You ran away, Elias. You abandoned everything. He sat down on the side of the road, his hands on his face, sweat mixed with the dust that covered his skin. He was tired, physically, yes, but the exhaustion that was hardest to bear was the emotional exhaustion. The pain of carrying the weight of doubt, shame, and guilt seemed more unbearable than the physical fatigue of hours of incessant work. He had made a decision on the battlefield, thinking it was the best choice. But now, with so many innocent people depending on his actions, he was no longer sure of anything. The memory of his abandonment was still vivid in his mind. He remembered the looks on his comrades' faces, the contempt of his superiors, the cutting words telling him he was not worthy of being among them. He felt a sharp pain every time he thought about it, a pain that seeped into his soul like poison. He felt as if he were in an internal war, more difficult than any physical combat. How could he overcome this? How could he look someone in the eye and consider himself trustworthy, worthy of respect after all he had done? I'm not a hero as I never was, Elias muttered to himself, feeling weakness take over his body, as if he were being dragged into an emotional abyss. But deep down, there was something that kept him standing, something that could not be ignored. He had saved lives that night, risked everything to rescue those who were about to be consumed by chaos. He was doing something he never imagined he was capable of, fighting not against visible enemies, but against his own inner demons. And as pain and guilt enveloped him, he began to realize an uncomfortable truth. The process of redemption would not be instantaneous. He couldn't erase his previous choice with a single action. It wouldn't be in a day, a night, or a battle that he would forgive himself. But maybe, just maybe, he could begin to redeem himself not by being perfect, but by continuing to fight, even when he believed he no longer had the strength to do so. Elias looked at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to rise, partially illuminating the remains of the burning city. He still felt the pain of doubt, but there was something else now. A flame, faint but present. It was a flame of hope. The same flame he had lost so long ago, but which, perhaps, was beginning to reignite. He got up, the weight of his soul still heavy, but now with a renewed purpose. The war, the internal battle, would not end any time soon, but he knew that in order to continue, he would have to face himself. He could no longer run away from himself. With every action he took, with every life he saved, he began to build something new. Not perfection, but the awareness that even in the greatest failures, there is a path to transformation. As he approached the survivors, Elias felt a wave of loneliness, but he also felt that he was finally accepting his own humanity. He was flawed, he had failed, but that didn't mean his journey was lost. He could still make a difference, not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to fight, to get back up again. And even with the weight of his guilt and fear, Elias was beginning to realize that perhaps true strength lay not in never falling, but in getting up after the fall. With a deep sigh, he looked around at the ruined city and, with determined eyes, he began to walk toward what could still be saved. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew that for the first time he was willing to face everything, including himself. Elias stood on the edge of what remained of his city, watching the flames that still licked the sky, engulfing everything he loved. The fire had subsided, but the weight on his heart was even greater than any fire that had consumed his streets. He knew his journey was far from over. There was Something in his chest, a growing sense of urgency that compelled him to do something that seemed impossible. He needed to go back, not just to the city, but to the battlefield. He needed to correct the mistakes that haunted him, and he knew there was no more room for hesitation. He thought about how he had arrived at that crossroads. It was as if his life had been a series of moments of escape, situations in which he had withdrawn, hidden, trying to escape the pain and shame. But now he could. No longer run away. Not from the war. Not from himself. He had already lost so much. If he didn't make a decision right then and there, if he didn't give himself over to the fight once and for all, he would lose himself completely. Elias looked at the city. There was something irreparable about its destruction, something that could not be fixed with words or simple gestures. But he knew that no matter how damaged the city was, there was still life. People needed him, and he couldn't be the man who abandoned his responsibility, the city he loved, those who depended on him. But what he feared most was the battle he would face within himself. He knew that the battlefield was not just somewhere far away, but within his own mind and heart. The memories of his mistake, the look of contempt from his former companions, the judgment of his own family. All of this was still fresh in his mind, more vivid than any flames that burned the city. And yet, as the flames died down in the city, something inside him began to ignite. Perhaps it was the pain that had shaped him, perhaps it was the need for redemption, but he felt it was time to move on. With a deep sigh, Elias did what, until then, seemed impossible. He grabbed his backpack, checked his weapons, and without further hesitation, began walking out of the city toward the battlefield. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his past decisions was tied to his feet. But he didn't stop. With each step, he felt something inside him being renewed. Doubt still accompanied him, but now it was different. It no longer controlled him, but challenged him to act. The road to the battlefield was no longer the same. The marks of destruction were everywhere, the devastated landscapes bearing witness to a past that Elias could not erase. But now, as he walked, he wondered if the battlefield was still the same. It wasn't just about the war he was fighting outside himself, but the internal struggle he still carried. How would he face his former comrades, knowing that many still saw him as a deserter? How could he earn redemption in the eyes of those who considered him a coward? He remembered his father's words, Marco's words, his mother's distant gaze. All the judgments echoed in his mind as he advanced toward the front line. But now, he felt there was something more important to be done. He needed to prove to himself that he could still be the man he always wanted to be. Not for others, not for the city, or his comrades, but for himself. Arriving at the military camp, the scene was almost unrecognizable. The army was in disarray, with men and women exhausted, demoralized by the long battle. The leaders were concerned about the lack of resources and the relentless advance of the enemy. The atmosphere was tense, and Elias felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. He knew that his return would not be greeted with celebrations or applause. He would not be hailed as a hero, but probably as someone to be disregarded. But he also knew that if he stayed there silent and doing nothing, the weight of his own conscience would consume him. He approached the commander, a man he knew well, and found him looking at the strategy maps, his face marked by exhaustion. "Commander, I need to talk to you," Elias said, his voice firm but laden with an emotional weight he could barely contain. The commander looked at him, surprised, and for a moment Elias braced himself for what was to come. The look of reproach, the cutting silence, the rejection. But instead the commander just watched him as if trying to understand the intentions of this man who, weeks ago, had fled the front line. "You came back, after everything that happened?" asked the commander, his voice low but charged with an intensity that reflected the tension in the air. Elias took a deep breath. He knew that at this point there was no way to hide the truth. He needed to be honest, not only with the commander, but with himself. "Yes, I came back. I made a mistake, and it's consuming me. But now I know what I have to do. I can't run away anymore. I need to fight. Not to redeem what I did, but to correct the damage I caused." and above all, to prove that I can still be the man my city needs," said Elias, his words heavy but full of determination. The commander looked at him silently for a long moment, as if weighing his words. The camp was in a tense calm, but the future of the war was still uncertain. Finally, the commander nodded slowly. "So what are you waiting for?" he said, before returning his gaze to the maps. "If you're here, it's because you know you have a role to play. Now go out there and do what needs to be done." Elias felt a wave of relief mixed with a new wave of responsibility. He knew he was no longer just fighting for military victory, but for his own redemption. He was no longer running away from the battlefield, from the city, or from himself. He was finally ready to face what lay ahead. No more excuses, no more hesitation. He had committed himself to righting the wrongs of the past, and that would be the real battle to be fought. He would not be the hero everyone expected, but he could at least begin to be the hero he himself needed to be. The final battle was unfolding on the horizon, a mass of darkness about to swallow what remained of the resistance. The battlefield was marked by days of skirmishes, exhausted resistance, and a relentless enemy. That advanced without stopping. The city of Elias, now a shadow of its former self, was not yet lost, but the soldiers were at their limit. Morale was low, hunger and fatigue undermined their fighting strength, and many began to doubt that victory was possible. The battlefield was at a stalemate, and the enemy knew it. They were ready to deliver the final blow. Elias stood watching the men and women who were with him. His eyes, now steadier, reflected the journey he had taken to get there. He knew that this was the moment that would define not only the battle, but his redemption. He was no longer the soldier who had fled, no longer the man marked by doubt and fear. He had become someone different, someone who knew that sometimes true bravery is not in winning, but in sacrificing oneself for something greater than oneself. The commander, in a makeshift tent, laid out the strategy for the few who remained capable of fighting. The last line of defense had to be maintained at all costs, but the price of that defense would be high. The siege was about to begin, and there was no time for hesitation. "The front line must be maintained. If we give in here, all will be lost," said the commander, his face marked by tension and despair. "We need a distraction, something that will allow the main forces to reorganize and resist until reinforcements arrive." Elias listened in silence. He knew what that distraction meant. It would be a suicidal maneuver, something that would require not only courage, but a daring strategy that would put everything he was at risk. But as much as fear consumed him, he knew that there was no more room for fear. The city, the people, and he himself needed something more. With a determination he never imagined he was capable of feeling, Elias rose from the shadows where he stood and approached the commander with a resolute look. "I will lead the distraction," said Elias, his voice firm, without hesitation. The commander looked at him in surprise, and for a moment he seemed to want to contest the decision, but he knew that Elias had changed, and somehow something in him had transformed. He had lost his fear. The commander simply nodded. "This is crazy, Elias. You know the risk," he said, but his voice was soft, as if recognition of Elias's bravery was inevitably forming. "I know, but there is no other option. I can no longer be the man who hides," Elias replied, his eyes fixed on the commander. "If the city has a chance, it starts with me. I will do whatever it takes." Elias knew that what he was proposing was not a conventional strategy. He planned to lead a direct attack on enemy lines, creating a breach, a gap in the siege, a window of opportunity for the remaining forces to regroup and launch an offensive. But to do so, he would need to give his all, use every ounce of his courage, every remnant of his energy. There was no room for error. The next morning, before dawn, he gathered a small group of soldiers who, like him, were willing to go all the way. The mission was clear: create the distraction necessary to ensure that the siege was broken and reinforcements could arrive. But there was one crucial detail that everyone knew. Elias would lead the direct attack on the most vulnerable point of the enemy army, giving his life for those who followed him. This was not just a distraction, it was the chance to ensure the city's survival. As they took their positions, The battlefield seemed to reverberate with palpable tension. The enemy was still unaware of the offensive that was about to be launched, but Elias knew the battle would be fierce. They would attack by surprise, but the price of such a surprise would be the loss of many men, perhaps all of them. He didn't care. What mattered was the future of the city, the future of the people who still had hope, and his own need to prove that he could be more than the man who had run away. The battle began with the sound of the first explosions, which broke the silence of the early morning. Elias and his men moved quickly, advancing over the treacherous terrain. They faced a much larger army, but speed and surprise were their allies. Every step Elias took was a step closer to sacrifice. He led the charge with relentless bravery, his eyes fixed on a single goal, the enemy line that needed to be broken. In an instant, the enemy front line opened up. Elias saw the space they had created. They were almost there. But the price of this momentary victory was high. Elias felt the searing pain of a bullet piercing his shoulder, and soon after a deep HT cut in his leg caused him to fall to the ground. Blood was flowing, but he got up instinctively, without thinking about his wounds, without caring about the pain. He was almost there. With a shout of command, he ordered his men to advance while he remained steadfast, like an anchor on the battlefield. He knew the distraction was working. Reinforcements were beginning to move. The city had a chance. But in a final act of courage, Elias lunged at the enemy leader, facing him head-on in a brutal confrontation. The combat was swift and fierce. With every move, Elias was aware that victory would not be his. But he fought like never before, giving his all, until finally, with one last blow, he knocked down the enemy commander, creating a definitive breach in the opposing lines. And at that moment, as he fell to the ground, his body broken and his strength fading, he knew. The mission was accomplished. Reinforcements arrived. The enemy line began to crumble. The city was saved. But behind the victory, the truth was revealed. Elias had paid the price for his redemption. He had not been the perfect hero, but he had sacrificed himself for what he believed in. He had finally become the man his city needed. He had overcome his limitations, his shame, and his fear. And as his vision began to darken, he smiled, knowing that even if this was his last battle, he had found the true meaning of courage, not as an invincible soldier, but as a man willing to do the impossible to right the wrongs of the past. He had found redemption, not in perfection, but in sacrifice. The battle was over, but the echoes of the fight still reverberated throughout the city. The sky, now clear of smoke and darkness, reflected the renewed hope of the people who had survived the nightmare. The streets, once filled with despair, were now full of life again. But it was not only the city that was being restored. It was also the story of a man, a soldier, who had lost himself in his own shame, but who, with courage, sacrificed himself to restore dignity and a future to those he loved. Elias lay on a makeshift bed on the battlefield, his body marked by wounds and scars, but his soul somehow lighter than ever. He knew he would not emerge from that battle unscathed, but there was something in his heart that transcended the pain. He had not fought to be recognized, nor to be glorified, but to correct a mistake that haunted him, to prove to himself that no matter how much he had failed, he was still capable of making a difference. And in doing so, he had transformed the very essence of his existence. The sun was beginning to set when Elias was taken back to the city. The journey, which had once seemed so distant and lonely, was now a walk he took with the certainty that he had finally found his purpose. The people who had once looked at him with contempt now saw him with different eyes. When he entered the main square, it was impossible not to feel the weight of the transformation in the air. First, a simple look of respect. Then, a nod of recognition. The city that had rejected him now came together to pay him homage. The first steps were timid, almost as if people still didn't know how to treat the man who had been marked by shame. But soon, the looks changed. The murmurs became applause, and little by little, the entire city, with its scars and renewed hopes, approached him. No longer as the cowardly soldier, but as the hero who had sacrificed everything for the good of all. Elias, still in pain, still with his wounded body, looked around. There were the familiar faces, those who had called him a coward, those who had lost faith in him. But now what he saw in their eyes was silent gratitude, deep respect. There was no more judgment, no more rejection. The man who had sacrificed himself for his city was no longer the one who had run away in the past, but the one who, with courage and dignity, had faced the impossible. His journey to redemption had not been easy. It had not been built on easy victories or glorious triumphs. It was forged in sacrifice, in error, in pain, and above all, in the decision to fight, even when he believed he had no strength left. But it was precisely this arduous path that made him stronger, more human. He didn't need to be perfect. He needed to be true, true to himself and to others. The words that had once been accusations were now hymns of gratitude. Those who had criticized him now approached him, offering their hands, their hearts. Elias didn't need applause or grand tributes. The simple recognition of those who had rejected him was enough. He knew he had proven himself, not to the world, but to himself. And as he looked at the people around him, he realized something he had never understood before. True redemption is not in the forgiveness of others, but in the forgiveness we give ourselves. He didn't need to be the perfect man everyone expected him to be. He just needed to be the man willing to fight for his city, for his honor, and most importantly, for who he really was. And as he took his last step, now as a recognized hero, Elias felt something he never thought possible: peace. He had overcome his limitations, his doubts, his shame. He was no longer the soldier who had run away, but the man who had faced his greatest fears and emerged victorious. Have you faced your own challenges, your own moments of defeat? Have you ever felt like Elias, unsure if you can get back up again? Remember, the greatest power of redemption lies in getting back up, in moving forward, no matter the failures. If you enjoyed this exciting journey and were inspired by Elias's story of overcoming adversity, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Every story like this reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there is always a chance to find the light. Subscribe and join us for more stories of courage, redemption, and overcoming adversity, because your journey deserves to be shared too.